governments and the large NGOs and financial institutions like the World Bank on what they are putting forward. And we call it a climate fault solution. And it involves the financialization of nature. It involves what people understand is called emissions trading, uh, carbon markets, carbon offsets, nature-based solutions that are linked to the market system. So that's a very important topic we want to talk about in this hour. We got some really good speakers here. And it involves something that we're being told, by large NGOs and governments that are promoting carbon markets. They're saying, don't worry about this. So our first speaker that I want to invite to speak is Mr. Alberto Saldamondo. He is a practicing attorney. He works for our IEN network. In fact, he was one of the drafters on the working group on drafting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So, Alberto, I have a question. Like I said, we're being told as we're part of rejecting carbon markets and calling it out as a false solution. In our movement to reject these as false solution now is becoming a threat to the organizers and supporters. They are telling our people, indigenous people at the grassroots level, in the Amazon, in the tropics, in the north, they're saying, don't worry. There's going to be safeguards. There's going to be instruments to prevent human rights and rights of indigenous peoples violations. Don't worry, there's going to be safeguards. So in your years of within the UN, what do you think about that?
Well, thank you, Tom. Good morning, everybody from New York. The topic of safeguards really came up when the UN was founded. The first Secretary General talked about UN activity not affecting the rights, human rights. Back in the 70s, the World Bank, because of complaints as to their development practices, developed Operative Number 7, I think, that required the states to, in terms of the implementation, to safeguard the rights of people. And they actually have a section, Part 7, I think, is on safeguarding indigenous peoples, not only physical patrimony, but their cultural patrimony as well. The problem has been with them, I did a little research, they have an ombudsman. So the process is that you complain to the ombudsman, and the ombudsman takes it to whoever makes the decision, and they come back and say, well, we're doing safeguards while we do our development practices. But that's really like a contradiction in terms, because as they do their development practices, they violate the rights of indigenous peoples. They violate the rights of many peoples, really. They affect their livelihoods, their agriculture, their spiritual lives, their spiritual connection to the land, and their self-determination. So what they say and what they do are really an oxymoron. It's business as usual. It's development as usual, and it affects indigenous peoples in particular, but many rural peoples as well. The UNFCCC, particularly the Paris Agreement, has taken up the rights of indigenous peoples. And there's a governing body, and the governing body does have a complaints procedure. And we're hoping that this complaints procedure will be a part of a safeguards. I mean, really, if there's a complaint that human rights have been violated or indigenous rights have been violated, then there has to be consequences. I mean, it's pointless to have a complaints procedure if there's no consequences to the complaint. So we're hoping, and we're hoping that within the UNFCCC and the governing body, we do have consequences, and those consequences would be that where offsets and credits are generated by the violation of the rights of indigenous peoples or the rights of peoples in general, that they be not disallowed totally their offsets and have them reduce their emissions at source. There's a particular problem with the UNFCCC with regard to REDS, the reduction of emissions from deforestation and the degradation of forests. There, it's called REDS and REDS Plus. So when a country invests in the forest, they can invest in non-forest dependent activity. That's what they call it. So, like in some countries, they will do like a plantation of trees to grow a certain nuts or whatever, or soya. And since it's not forest related, not forest dependent, they can continue that activity. So there are really no safeguards with regard to REDS and REDS Plus, as these corporations and as states invest in offsets with regard to their investment in forests. There's no real safeguard. There's no real protection for the rights of indigenous peoples. There's also a question about whether or not there's what's in Article 6.8 of the Paris Agreement calls for what is it called? Non-market approaches. Thank you. Non-market approaches are supposed to be like investments. Say a university or a fund wants to invest in REDS or in some other kind of sustainable sustainable activity with regard to the environment. By the stroke of a pen, those non-market approaches can become market approaches. They're just put into a database almost automatically. So even there, within those safeguards, within those protections for the rights of indigenous peoples and for the rights of anybody in particular, really, there is no protection. And countries can invest in offsets. In 6.2 and 6.4 is the global bank that can be used by corporations, by carbon cowboys, by countries, by organizations, to invest in forests, to invest in agriculture, and there is no consequence. And the rights of indigenous peoples are still being violated. So we're hoping and we're still pushing. They really don't need, I mean, the corporations don't need the UNFCCC. They go outside of the UNFCCC. They make their investments through the World Bank. They make their investments as a corporation, and they affect the rights of indigenous peoples. They affect their livelihoods, their territories, and there are no consequences. But we also go outside, and we also go to shareholders meetings. We identify the banks that are most responsible for those investments. And if the World Bank, what is it? Goldman Sachs has invested trillions since the Paris Agreement in these agricultural programs, and primarily in the development and use of fossil fuels, the infrastructure. So we're going to their we're trying to get retirement funds to withdraw their funds from these banks, and some have actually. I think the nurses have in some jurisdictions. The unions have. So we're trying to get them to divest from these organizations, from these banks that really are causing and funding a great much of the problem. And we're hoping that there is even the divestment program grows. We have a divestment organizer, and I think it promises to do some good, at least to hurt them a little bit where they really feel it, and that's their money. So I think that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. You notice Alberto used a couple of acronyms. The UNFCCC is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And we just got back from this past November from the 30th year, the 30th session of the Conference of the Parties, called COP30. Um, and also the understanding of these initiatives like Red Plus that was mentioned, carbon offsets, nature-based solutions. They treat the carbon in the trees of the Amazon as a carbon sponge. You've heard a terminology, if you Google search, that corporations, polluters, fossil fuel industry, that they're going carbon neutral. It's kind of like a weight, to where they're balancing out their production, their releases of carbon emissions and toxic chemicals into the atmosphere. And they say that we're going neutral. And you ask them, how are you doing that? Our relatives in Richmond, California, in the Bay Area, San Francisco, Chevron is expanding the release of carbon emissions. They're expanding. They're not cutting back the production of fossil fuels in their oil refineries. And community people ask you, how come you're not part of cutting back fossil fuels? They say, you don't understand. They said, what is it we don't understand? They said, we're going carbon neutral. How are you going carbon neutral is the question that people ask them. They said, well, we're investing in the carbon in the trees of the Amazon. And that is the way we're controlling carbon. But there's been studies that says it's a scam. It doesn't add up, the numbers system. So with that said, one of the main concerns that our traditional relatives back home, and the legal, not the legal scholars, but the ones who are the spiritual authorities, one of the concerns that they've expressed to me and our people, as we explain this methodology of the privatization of carbon and bringing that into a white man market system, a colonial market system, to treat carbon in a trading mechanism. You treat it as a commodity. So please Google search that. We can't go entirely into this, but to treat it as a commodity, they have to determine whose property right carbon is in order for a polluting corporation like Chevron, like Shell, ExxonMobil, to be going carbon neutral, involving their practices in a market system to look good on paper. It involved the privatization. They own the carbon. They own the carbon in the trees that they are investing in, not our indigenous peoples. It's another form of taking of land, taking of our trees. Now they're claiming property over the carbon of the atmosphere that we breathe and the science process of carbon in our trees. So our next person I'm inviting to respond to this is from the Anishinaabe peoples in the Great Lakes in northern Minnesota. We've invited her. She's a community representative. She was involved with the Line 3, the Enbridge Line 3, bringing toxic oil from the tar sands in Canada and going through her homeland, through the wetlands. And they stood up in resistance because no pipeline can say that there will never be a leak. But this is something she took on as impact to her people, and she became a delegate to these climate negotiations. And she asked, what is this all about carbon markets, carbon trading, cap and trade, offsets, things like that. And she studied that, looked at it. I'd like to ask you, what do you feel about this system that we're being told is a solution to the climate crisis that involves the privatization, the marketing of air, the air in our trees, the air that our trees breathe in and exhale on. How do you feel about that um, as a traditional elder that is participating in these? Great grandmother, Mary Lyons. Thank you.
Mino Gesep, Nijnivikwa Indigenous. I'm saying good morning, and my name is Second Water Woman in my language. And thank you, Tom, for the question. We could probably talk endlessly on what this topic is, but realistically, we have to talk common sense. Because if you don't have common sense up against a financial science market, then you have no communication, right? It's really simple. There's 4 elements that structures this planet and everything in it. We talk about the entrance of we just as embryos coming into life as every other embryo that comes in, or any other entity of life that enters this planet and out there. It's bred within a womb. It swims within water. It enters the system. It breathes air. It feels the air, the fire, and it nourishes and plants himself on Mother Earth. You see what's going on here. If we continue to do it, we're going to interrupt memory. And the memory of what this life cycle is about. Because, we talk about the trees, and we expect the trees to give us this clean oxygen and out there. But we forget about that relationship that tree has with the earth and has with the water, and all that containment that happens within this revolving life cycle in Mother Earth. And they think that they can go in and extract and do what they want to do without any repercussions. And the only way I could think of it is if I was telling my grandchildren or somebody that didn't know what we were talking about. Let's talk about your body. I want to extract some of that blood out of you, and I really want to take this much from you, and then expect you to walk around real healthy. Realistically, what happens when you have blood taken from you, you become very weak. And the common sense of what we're talking about, no matter how scientific, no matter what they put on it, no matter what they tell you it's going to be good or whatever it is, it's a false solution. Because when you interrupt that life cycle, you're interrupting the organic way that it was meant for us to be. I hope that makes sense. The other part of it, too, is when we really talk about when they do one thing for profit, it's a camouflage for something that they have done prior to it, or they're looking for the future to market something else. I had spoke about this a while ago. I had a talk with some health people, and we talked about a lot of the nurses in the school. And when I stopped by one of the schools on one of those meetings out there, I noticed there was a lot of children standing in line for the nurse's office. And I thought, well, why is there so many kids to be, is it sick, or should I be afraid? Whatever it is. We kind of laughed, and she said, oh, no, they're coming for their medication, or they're coming for their inhaler. And if everybody really starts thinking about it, even within their own community and out there, what is one of the number one markets for sale is these inhalers. I've never heard of us having asthma when I was younger. So how do we fit this behavior into what they're trying to say, what they're going to better for us? What is the profit in the end, we always say? Why do we have so many allergies? Why is this going on? So we always talk about, when you interrupt the earth, and it's kind of like as if you had a really dusty table and you want to brush that dust up. Those particles go in the air and just keeps moving. It's the same thing what they're talking about, same thing what we're talking about on anything that's going to try to better for us. The best thing you can better for us is leave it alone. Leave it alone. I cannot say that anymore. Um, from when I was younger and what I see today, there's such a great change. And you got to remember, this lifestyle, what we're living now, it took us 150 years to accomplish. It took us 150 years to destroy an organic way of life. And when I talk about that, anything that happens to that air is going to come back to us as humans, as plants, in water. That whole cycle of life is interrupted. And we're going to feel the repercussions or we'll feel the benefits. It depends on which way we want to approach this. You know, why do we want to buy into a lot of this? I just can't understand, you know, the organic way of life is that we nourish from healthy water that has a lot of things that our body needs and not the water that we're drinking from these bottles because there's no life in it. It's filtered and filtered and filtered, and we have to drink so much of it. Where before, if you have life in that water from those waters in out there, one scoop of water, and it sustains you for several days because it's got memory, you've got relationships in it. And when you start destroying that, your life cycle, even in you, starts lessening. And not only that, just think about that memory. Is when you take that memory out of it, how is that organicness of everything within that life cycle? We talk about water, that's air. Everything, everyone needs it. So we have to really get back to the basics and really start thinking about how good are we as a gardener to our own homeland so we can sustain it for our future as our ancestors sustained it for us today. I hope that makes sense. You really have to think about it in a common way of not being so, you know, like a lot of these companies, they'll tell you all of the stuff they can do. They can put money on you. They can give you this and they give you that. And if you have a community that is not really familiar with their organicness of what they're losing and the poverty hits and out there, they may buy into it. And then they will suffer the consequences later because it's a lot of health issues. So when you go back to the beginning and when you start really thinking about what you can achieve without having to have all this futuristic, what they quote unquote market you, you'll live a longer and a better life. I hope that makes sense. You know, in closing, what I wanted to say is that, you know, when I look at my great-granddaughter, I'm so proud that she knows what I'm talking about. But what saddens me is the majority of her community has no clue. They have no clue. So the question at hand is, how do we reach them? Because one thing I can tell you who's reaching them right now is hospitals. We have more hospitals, more drugstores, more everything that harms us. So we have to think about it. You know, we have to really think about coming back to the basics and being more responsible for us. We have to say to ourselves, what are we willing to give up so we can be more successful the way our ancestors were? So I want to say Chimiigwech, thank you.
Nina Wopida Kunshi Mary Lyons. Thank you, Grandmother Mary Lyons. This makes me think about our relationship with each other, our relationship as humanity throughout the world. Unchimaka, Grandmother Earth. Our relationship to animals, to the birds, the fish, all living entities, our relationship to plants and medicines. They call it the biodiversity, the diversity of the biology of the world, even into the genetic sacred information that we have and our spiritual authorities understand. So it's very important that we look at these things as relationships. And within woven into that, there is a term in our eastern Dakota of Minnesota about Midakie Owasi is we are all related. A very important concept of relationship. And even our relationship that has its foundation on our grandmother earth, Unchimaka. And recognizing this term that many people throughout the world learned when our people stood firm resisting the Dakota Access Pipeline in the Dakotas. There's a word that came out of there that water is life, but it was in the Lakota language, Miniwachoni. Water is life. Very important concept. And what we're going to talk about now, our next speaker, is the biodiversity of life that's becoming part of a trading mechanism called biodiversity credits and offsets. There's a term that many people from back home had know about Unchimaka Wichoni Maku. Grandmother Earth gives me life, and understands that sacred energy of the Creator, that great mystery. Wakantanka Wichoni Maku. The Great Spirit gives me life. Mini Wichoni, again that word of life. It goes deep into description. So Mr. Michael Lane works on our Indigenous Sovereignty Advocacy Program with the Indigenous Environmental Network. We work with developing tools that are Indigenous-based with how to introduce a Rights of Mother Earth initiative within our homelands. But he's also very involved with this new phenomenon. To some degree it's new. In Minnesota, it's already been practiced. A developer may want to damage a wetland over here. And under Minnesota laws in the state of the United States, that developer can use his, they monies to restore a wetland way over here in another part of the state that gives them a right to do damage at this wetland. They mitigate by damaging this, destroying the relationship to the water, the rising and life in this wetland, and they restore a wetland way over here. So now it's being implemented globally, and the mining companies are just so happy. They can mitigate mining and expansion of mining from this part of the world by saying, we're participating in this biological diversity credits and offset system. Just like we just heard, carbon neutral, an offset that a fossil fuel company can greenwash itself to look good and say, we've gone carbon neutral. And now it's the mining companies coming into our backyard. So Mr. Michael Lane, I'd like to ask, what's your response to this movement by the corporations, the world banks, by the states, nation states that are pushing biological credits and offsets?
Well, the short answer is it's bad. But carrying on from there, a lot of you have heard about carbon credits by this time. A lot of people don't know that that's $1 billion market, right? They're estimating the biodiversity credit market to be $1 trillion market. And they're run by the same people doing the carbon markets. And now they're even playing off, like Conservation International is a really bad one. They're saying, oh, let's move away from carbon credits, because they're also heavily investing in biodiversity credits, which also are tied to the carbon markets too. it's a Ponzi scheme. It's a con job. We can openly say it's a con job. So don't even think that there's any legitimacy to it other than being what it is, a con job. And they're promoting something that I'm going to tie it into something called the termination agenda. The termination agenda is about extinguishing inherent rights of indigenous peoples in exchange for delegated rights from the nation states. One has to understand that indigenous peoples have inherent, distinct, and collective rights. The Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, established that indigenous peoples have distinct and collective rights, but guess what? The nation states have co-opted it, and they're using that to apply to local communities. Now, to be clear, they're trying to conflate indigenous peoples with local communities at the UN level, in these spaces here, in large part to foster development. The motive is to foster things like carbon credits, biodiversity credits, and other developments, because those with inherent rights have legal standing to oppose them. So by eliminating that, terminating our inherent identities, helps them to develop these kind of Ponzi schemes. And so that's a very big concern. Now, we're not against local communities, to be clear. For us, local communities are self-organizing, have a right to self-organize, and should become a recognized constituency. So we support that. What we don't support are nation states saying they oppose local community self-organizing because they want to use them as proxies for themselves in these spaces when they conflate us with them. So it's really important to understand the motive for that is to promote these kind of marketing systems. Because at the end of the day, that's what's impacting all of us as people that want to protect lands and waters. Now, when we talk about these markets, what are they opposing? We have a phrase that we've developed a process, not process, we're working on a legal jurisprudence called inherent relationships jurisprudence. And it's recognizing the very things that great-grandmother Mary Lyons was talking about, the same things that Alberta was talking about and Tom. It's recognizing that it's that indigenous traditional knowledge that's the foundation of our political movements. It's the foundations of our political realities. We may have something in the U.S. called tribal sovereignty that's important to protect. It's also a recognition of something inherently existing before the U.S. in legal decisions. It doesn't come from Congress, doesn't come from treaties, it doesn't come from the Constitution. It inherently exists, and that's what the Supreme Court found. When we talk about the right to self-government in Canada, it's recognized to inherently exist. The efforts to do these comprehensive land claims are taking away the word inherent in places like British Columbia in Canada, Treaty of Waitangi process in New Zealand, and other places. They're doing their modern treaties in Chile. These are all about removing that inherent identity, which is about practicing those traditional ways and asserting them as our identity. And so this is really crucial. Some of the work that we're doing here may seem kind of technical, but that's how they do it. A lot of what they're doing is very subtle, very technical. And so there's no way to say we're protecting lands and waters without understanding some of the agendas that they're doing to impact our rights and responsibilities as well. So when we talk about inherent relationship jurisprudence, we're talking about not just rights, which is from a Eurocentric legal lens. We're also talking about our inherent responsibilities. Almost all indigenous legal systems that we're aware of are responsibility-based, not rights-based. It doesn't mean they're incompatible with one another. It doesn't mean they can't work linking arms together. Similar to the Tuo Wampum Treaty of the Haudenosaunee that established the treaty-making process that the Brits ended up inheriting from the Dutch. So that relationship is really important because it's about maintaining our distinct identities. We can still link arms together with our distinct identities. It's not about equality. It's about equitability. In the sense that, from a legal sense, it's about having the same status of maintaining distinct identity. And so the organizing we do around inherent relationship jurisprudence does work with the rights of nature movement, but from an indigenous lens on inherent responsibilities, not just inherent rights. In this world we live in, we have to establish a rights-based protections, whether it be human rights law, indigenous people's rights. It's imperative that we do that defensive effort, but we also do the proactive efforts too. And that's where we're doing with inherent relationship jurisprudence. That's what we're doing in imposing the carbon markets and the biodiversity markets, because these are all threats. From a very pragmatic level, carbon markets. We look at carbon and biodiversity markets. What do tribes have to give up in the U.S. to engage with them? They have to waive sovereign immunity. That's a big protection for any sovereign group. A lot of people that engage in this stuff don't even know, because they don't say waiver of sovereign immunity in, big bold letters and a neon sign. It's embedded in the small print. I live in Aotearoa, New Zealand. My wife is from Tuhoi, Ngāti and Ngāpuhi, and we've been there for a long time. And the Treaty of Waitangi settlement process, they never say we're extinguishing your inherent rights, these claims. They say, well, we're sorry for the past wrongs. You accept our apology. Here's some money that's to you, but they don't actually give it to the actual iwi or tribe. They go to a crown-created entity, and the tribe members are beneficiaries, and they have no jurisdictional authority, but they say, yeah, if you forgive us, it's all good, here's the money. What they don't say is, by forgiving them, you can't claim that the interference with your inherent rights was by them, because you've waived it. It's from an obscure Canadian decision that, of course, most people in New Zealand know nothing about. So, and they do the same tricks in Canada regarding U.S. and New Zealand, same tricks here. Well, I'm sure they're doing the same tricks down in Chile, and it's all about development. It's all about oil, gas, critical minerals. Make no mistake about it. There's a motive here. It ain't benign. And these carbon markets are a big part of that, and the biodiversity markets are going to be a bigger part. We're working with a First Nation up in Northern Ontario. They got all this. They were offered all of this money, $400 million, for protection of the James Bay. What tribal community is going to say no to that? They didn't say any strings were attached, but it turned out to be the burgeoning biodiversity credit market. There are strings attached, but they don't advertise those strings. So it's important that people are very aware of these tricks that are used to get people to buy into these carbon markets and blue credit markets. Another example is the whales. A lot have heard of whales. Anyone here in the audience heard of whales? They're real creatures that live in the sea. Anyways, they're trying to do, what's become known is that they're trying to do carbon markets to them. And the company I was referring to earlier, what they're being cunning about is saying, you know what? Carbon markets may not be a good thing. But we got to find some way to fund the conservation of whales. Well, guess what the fund they're talking about is? Biodiversity credits. And it's the same outfit with a different name. So, so they can respond to criticism by just moving to the other market. And I'm sure the inverse is also probably happening too. So, to sum it up, it's bad. And we really need to be aware that how bad it is. So it's not just about defending our rights, it's about asserting our rights for the protection of lands and waters for our future generations. And that's really what the battle is really about. Because what will we have left, when everything's contaminated? So the same thing Great-Grandmother Mary Lyons is talking about. How do we protect that? And that's what we're really doing here. And that's why it's so important that people pay attention to what's happening with both the carbon credits and biodiversity credits. It's a serious, subtle threat that people are overlooking. It's going under the radar. So at this stage, is that? So thank you, Tom, for your important question.
I'm asking one of our associates how many minutes we have left on this presentation. 15. Okay, very, very, thank you. Thank you. My hand reaches out to you to give you thanks. Na pechi yazapado. To our audience, this is very important on what we're talking about. Somehow in these technicalities of these climate negotiations of the UN climate framework and climate change has now crept into the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, where biological credits and offsets are being introduced. Now we're seeing the harmonization of the United Nations CBD and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, they're coming together. We see the political leaders, especially the wealthy countries of the North, who are the leading entities in these negotiations, pushing these false solutions. In our ceremonies back home, years ago, 2002, 2004, I had to seek some clarification about what I was experiencing going to the UN. They said, you got to watch out. You got to watch out. Because what they are saying is not about truth. Watch out for that, the truth. But said that they are wanting to control Mother Earth. They are wanting to control the atmosphere, the sky. And now even the stars. All life, even down to the genetic information. So, with the consultation and direction of the spiritual authorities for us, this also includes now artificial intelligence, AI. Because now in our work, we're seeing evidence that they wanted to utilize AI and the formation of these huge data centers in the area of climate change, the collection of data, and the collection of these mitigation strategies around carbon markets. There have always been questions about what is the methodology to ensure that the science behind the trading of emissions and carbon, that it's sound, that it's valid, that it's got integrity. Because that word integrity also bears upon a trading mechanism. They got to prove it has integrity, even if it involves them stretching the truth. So your participation on steadying this matrix system, privatizing the sacredness of Mother Earth. Also, privatization of the sacredness of Mother Earth and what we've been describing. It's allowing the fossil fuel companies not to phase out fossil fuels. They fight at these meetings. No, the wealthy nations. No, we're not going to phase out. We're not going to work towards keeping fossil fuel in the ground, even though it's proven, science, that the root cause of the climate crisis is the overproduction of fossil fuels, the concentration of the compounding changes that are going about with fossil fuels. Since 2015, at the Paris Accord, the special international agreement to keep the limit of the expansion of the climate change under 1.5 Celsius. No, fossil fuels have gotten richer. The investments, how many trillions of dollars is it? It's
Hundreds.
It's grown. Trillions of dollars of increased investments from the World Bank to the financial institutions. Fossil fuels is growing. And the way that they get away with it, they greenwash and say, we are pursuing emissions reduction through carbon markets. We have gone carbon neutral. The mining companies are going to say that. So it is an attack of it is a termination of who we are as indigenous peoples. It is. They don't want us to be who we are. following our original instructions, our teachings. And language is one of those. They're threatened by those indigenous people that are strengthening our language, because our language identifies our memory and our relationship to the sacredness of Mother Earth. Our women's societies understand this the same way that the patriarch system, the men's system control our woman, came from Europe too. They want to control the creative principles of Mother Earth. That's how insane this system is. So with that said, the final question to everyone. Really brief, be really brief, starting with Alberto, great-grandmother Mary Lyons, and Michael Lane. What is the solution for climate change? What is the solution?
I think I have to, for the solution, I think I have to go back to what Mary's talking about with regards to our relationship to the earth. Every human being has a memory, a genetic memory of what it was like, not just indigenous peoples, but Europeans too, had a relationship to the earth, had a connection to the earth. It's not just the teepees that are out there guiding the stars or being led by the stars. It's everyone has that relationship. And if they start remembering that relationship, if they start connecting themselves back to the earth as their ancestors did, then I think it's possible to do something about climate change. But one question I always have is, when they invest in whales, when they invest in trees, who owns the trees? They become the commodity. In fact, human beings at some point are going to, as biodiversity credits, are going to become part of this whole agenda. But really, I think we have to remember, we have to go back to where our ancestors were and really reaffirm that connection to the land. Thank you.
Well, I was always taught that when you enter the space, you enter as a student, you walk as a student, and you leave as a student. And my ancestors always taught us that we come as good caretakers. Because when you caretake, you're taking on responsibility from the past, teaching today young people to continue it into the future. We did not come as landlords. Landlords take and take and take. But one thing they can't take with them when they pass out of this world is what they created. But what they will leave behind is such destruction. And they can't even keep that relationship in a good way, knowing that that harm isn't just happening to their pocketbooks, it's happening to the people that they love. That it's just not going to affect indigenous people. This is going to be a global effect. So, Creator had this original agreement, and he said, you know what? This is your responsibility. You come as a student, walk as a student, and you leave as a student. And be as good as you possibly can. And that'll be your imprint. So when you look back down, you will see people smiling because you'll still see that beautiful garden that you helped nourish. So that's my closing.
To me, the bottom line is, don't drink the Kool-Aid. Drink water, real water. And I don't say that just as a throwaway line. It's really important that people just don't accept the con jobs put out by corporate shills. A lot of our peoples do drink the Kool-Aid. Don't drink the Kool-Aid, because it does not just undermines our rights, it undermines our very survival. And that's really what's at stake here. And the fact of the matter is, because of our interesting nature with our inherent rights, if you don't remember anything else, remember that word inherent. It doesn't just protect indigenous peoples, it protects all peoples, because we have what they call in the non-indigenous legal system legal standing. Where a lot of people don't have that same legal standing, so they have to assert these things in a way it often gets dismissed as frivolous. For us, it's not necessarily get dismissed as frivolous. We have that inward in that legal system that we can actually embrace others to be supported in that way. So don't drink the Kool-Aid. That's the bottom line. Hope.
Well, again, thank you very much. In our remaining couple minutes, I'm thinking of a session that we're going to be part of this afternoon here in New York at the UN Church building at 1 to 3. That's to talk about jaguars. We mentioned whales, but also they are pursuing to include jaguars as far as part of this carbon market system. And back up north is the buffalo. So you got to really think deep on some of these. We ask why are now they reaching out to our relatives that play a strong role in our identity culturally and spiritually. A lot of these life, they're part of our genesis. They're part of the story of who we are and how we come to be. And that's important, as I mentioned earlier, language. As a lot of those teachings cannot be translated into English, a dominant world language. It's unique because what I talked about in the genesis of our own indigenous genesis is language that defines and clarifies our relationship to the jaguar, to the whale, to the buffalo, to the lions. They're even, you can Google search, they're even including lions. We talked about the waters. Now they call this carbon market, they have a version of it called blue carbon. The carbon in the oceans. They have gone into the oceans. Critical minerals that we are preparing to organize globally as indigenous peoples. Critical minerals in the oceans exist too. They're going into the oceans. So it's very important for us as humanity to continue to be strong and be concerned, please, on the protection of our future generations, our young people, our youth who are here now. They're going to be elders soon. You're going to be elders. One of the benchmarks the governments have set to see if they were successful on mitigating and adapting to a change in the climate is 2050. Our youth are going to be elders. I will no longer be here. That's why this is important to talk about. A process of taking away the power of the people of the world. That's why we are also part of organizing throughout the regions of the world our own people summit, our own people's conferences of the grassroots of the world to also strengthen our voice. So with that said, I thank you very much. I thank Cultural Survival. I thank every one of our speakers and many of the others that we are meeting here at this UN meeting. Thank you all. Nina Wopata Tonka. Thank you very much. Achehat on my Navajo side. Achehat Wopata Pidamayato. So we'll see you later. Dokshta Ake. Thank you.